G'day guys, thanks very much for coming along. So my name is Vincent van Uitregt, but I'm better known as Billy. I haven't given any of my affiliations here because I'm not really here as a departmental employee, I'm more here as an individual. So it's a bit of an experiment on speaking as an individual rather than a researcher. Just want to kick off by recognising this as Kaurna country and pay my respects to the old people of this place. I'll be talking a little bit about Wanandu-Yakwa up on Groote Island, so I recognise them and their old people, their country, and also the Indigenous philosophers whose thinking is kind of built into this presentation. This image probably doesn't mean a lot to anybody except for me and my brother. So this is, it's a celebration, it's like an artistic celebration of my brother's and mine's whakapapa, which is like our heritage. So I had it commissioned for his 30th birthday, which is a few years back now, and it celebrates our Dutch heritage through the klompen or the clogs, and that's on our father's side, and also our Māori heritage on our mother's side. And so the artwork on there, or the tāmoko on there, represents our iwi or our tribal associations. So for my brother and I, we were raised by two people that come from very different cultures and view life in a very different way and operate within life in a very different way. So I think for us, it kind of comes naturally to kind of recognise that there's different ways to view life and there's different ways to operate within it, and the ways that we do it are kind of built into us from our culture. What I hope for you fellas to take away, and I'm assuming most people are scientists or science communication people in the room, is that there are actually valid ways to construct knowledge outside of Western scientific method. My intent is not to convince you that one is better than the other, but simply that they are cultural constructs, and they are constructed from the cultures from within which they originate. And further to that, I guess what I'm hoping to do is identify that one isn't better than the other, but they each are cultural constructs and come with weaknesses and strengths of their own. So that's the kind of take-home message that I'm hoping you get. I'm most definitely not going to give you all that you need to know, but hopefully I'm just going to try and pique the interest of your inquiring minds to go and do some of this thinking for yourselves. I also have to disclose I don't speak with any Māori cultural authority on how Māori construct knowledge. I was born and raised in Australia, as you can probably tell from my lack of a Kiwi accent. And I was educated in the Western education system like most of you fellas were. I probably took it a little bit too far and went ahead and got a PhD. So it wasn't a total waste of time, but I certainly don't work in my field. So my research focused on evolutionary ecology. So if you were kind of taking a pure science perspective of it, I was investigating the evolutionary maintenance of adaptive phenotypic plasticity. Eyes roll back when they hear those words. It's not important what that means. If I was trying to sexy it up to anybody that I was talking to, I'd say, oh, I'm just trying to figure out if we can bugger over mosquito larvae while they're larvae so that we can limit their ability to transmit disease as adults. And that's kind of, this was just one of the slides from one of my presentations. Needless to say, malaria is still a thing. I didn't solve any of the world's problems. But I guess what I'm trying to get out of this slide is that I published some papers, so I do actually have some credibility as a Western scientist. Hopefully that kind of shows. Like most PhDs, I took way too long, so I had to take on some paid work. For my supervisor, who was starting to work up on Groote Island in the Northern Territory with the Wanandu-Yakwa Land and Sea Ranges. And we got to work on these buggers, which is a northern quoll. Really cool life history. They're the largest semmelparous mammal for the animal nerds in the room. They're really cool. It's not super important. But the long and short of that story is that I got to work with the Wanandu-Yakwa Rangers, who are Aboriginal crew, own their lands, and live on country quite intimately, for lack of a better phrase. And when I went into this work, I think this image kind of demonstrates my mindset at the time. I was going to go and teach these fellas how to do science. So there's big time scientists coming in and really trying to get them to understand the ecology of their island. Kind of ridiculous. And there's a bit of shame at this photo now. I think of this as one of my white saviour photos, but nonetheless it exists and there's a few others out there. But before too long, it became really obvious that I was the one who was going to get the lessons in how to understand the ecology of these fellas' island. And this old Alara man, he was probably he was super knowledgeable and one of the best teachers on island. And in this instance, we were out or camping out on country, and Sammy's job was to teach us how to kind of go out and survive on country. So we had to catch ourselves a feed. And to do that, you need to have some pretty hectic ecological knowledge of that environment. So first of all, you need to be able to make yourself spear. You need to know which species of tree that you need to target, and they're definitely not really abundant across the island. And then you need to know how to construct a spear that's actually functional. Second to that, you need to know where the fish are, when and where they're going to be, otherwise you're just wasting your time out in the hot sun. And probably most importantly, you need to know where and when the crocs aren't going to be. Because while you're catching yourself a feed, you don't want to become a feed for somebody else. It's probably the kind of kicker. Needless to say that if I wasn't out there with these fellas, I would have gone hungry. For a couple of reasons. My spear was more like a harpoon, and you're definitely not going to catch any fish with that. And the other thing, I was way too scared to even get in the water. Sammy was in the water up to his chest, and I was kind of just sitting on he's going, come on, there's no crocs, it's fine. It's like, there's croc slides everywhere. I was just standing on the bank thinking of what an OH&S nightmare I'd found myself in, because all that responsibility fell to me. So luckily no one got taken, but it seemed like I was the only one who was worried about that anyway. Elma Langer, she is an amazing ecologist on island as well, and she was always amazing at bringing back a feed of mud mussels and sugar bag. It was kind of her specialty. And so in the end, really my job was to bring the snags as a kind of a backup option. And obviously you have to bring flour as well for the damper, and butter, and you definitely need butter, but also maple syrup, because damper's not that good without it. But I think the take-home story there is that my ecological knowledge and my ability to construct knowledge was in no way even a close match to these fellas' intimate knowledge, ecological knowledge of their environment. And that's kind of what I want to explore with you fellas today, because I think scientists in this kind of era, I think somebody said it just before, are kind of going back into their shell and kind of putting up walls maybe. I think it's really important that you start engaging with other knowledge constructors. So let's take a step back, and I think you need to, and try and start thinking about Western scientific knowledge, method and knowledge construction versus Indigenous scientific method and knowledge construction. So fellas will be familiar with Charles Darwin. So the knowledge that he's constructed is kind of pertinent to everybody's work in this room. He's changed the way we think about life and animals and ecology and the environment. But I think the first point we need to start off with is get ourselves familiar with the word epistemology. So I'll admit that I had no idea what it meant. I was using it out of context as recently as last year. So this is really good. But to confirm with everybody else in the room who's like me, epistemology is the theory of knowledge, especially with regard to its methods, validity and scope, and the distinction between justified belief and opinion. So Charles Darwin, I actually want to point out, it's quite critical, is an Englishman. He was born in Shropshire in 1809 and in England, and he died in Kent in 1882, I think. And like I said, his thinking and his knowledge permeates all the thinking that we do. 3 minutes? Whoa. Okay, so just quick sticks. Just throw up a rough kind of mud map of how Western scientists construct knowledge. So we theorise, we try and understand something within the context of a theory. We make some observations. We analyse those observations within the context of that theory that we've kind of framed ourselves with. We discuss with our colleagues. We bring it to conferences like these and have a yarn about it. When we're feeling good, we write it all down. There might be a bit more discussion while we've written it down. And when we're feeling super good about it, we go, oh, this is so good, it's ready for publication. I'm going to throw it out to a journal. It goes out for peer review in that process. And that process is kind of key to kind of determine whether that knowledge that you've constructed is actually valid. If it is valid, it's published into a journal, which goes on databases, all the other knowledge constructors or scientists around the world can engage with that and recognise that it's been constructed and that you're the author, you're the constructor of that knowledge. So while we've got that up on the screen, I kind of want to have a look at Indigenous knowledge construction. And to do that, I'm just going to read out a quote from a Māori philosopher who's talking about mātauranga Māori, which is, in my opinion, like the Māori equivalent of epistemology. So that can be defined as the knowledge, comprehension or understanding of everything visible and invisible existing in the universe, and it's often used synonymously with wisdom. So while I read that out, I'm going to keep that up there, and hopefully when reading out the quote, you guys can make some links between how Western scientists do it. Might not happen in the same order, but there's some similarities there. Okay, so this is all in quotation marks. Our tupuna, or ancestors, were obviously great scientists and scholars. How else were we able to adapt and survive in our respective lands? The navigation and maritime skills of my Polynesian forebears and the great civilizations and technologies of yours proves this. However, it is the way they acquired and analysed knowledge which differs to Western scientific method. The tohunga, or the knowledge keepers, of my people also used observation and experimentation. They would cross-examine travellers and explorers, and they would gather to debate the tenets of knowledge, and this is why this was one of the functions of Taputapuatia Marae in Rangiatia, which is an island in Society Islands. And the knowledge thus procured would be integrated and compared to myth, define schemes, and thus become accepted truth. The methods they used, however, were not theory-based abstractions, as in Western science. They were practical, experience-orientated observations made whilst involved in a given activity. Thus, the Polynesians had tohunga tātai arorangi, professional navigators, who knew everything there was to know about navigation and locating yourself at sea by actually observing the stars and going out on their ships, tasting and feeling the water for salinity and temperature, and observing the movements of the sea and air currents, sea swells, fish and birds. So hopefully while I was reading that out, you could draw some parallels between how we're wrapping up. Okay. As a Western scientist myself, I think one of the things that stands out as a difference is how you actually store your knowledge. Like I said, Western science publish it, it's there for everybody to interact with. So if you come from a Māori culture, which is predominantly orative, how might you store your knowledge and then transfer it out for other people? There's a couple of ways that I can think of. You just tell people directly. You store it up in your brain, you tell people directly. You can store it in your tāmoko or your artwork, and that tells a story as well. And I think particularly for Māori, Māori mythology, which are and stories that are core to Māori culture, have a lot of knowledge ingrained into them. The other distinction, how long do I actually have? 1 minute. Okay, no questions. Okay, the other key distinction is the kind of fundamental place where you come from when you're asking questions about natural phenomenon. For Māori, you go, what is that and how does it relate to me? For Westerners, it's what is that and what does it do? And this is kind of characterised in the Wanganui River, which has just been given legal rights as a person. So that kind of recognises the river, or the Māori conception of the river as being an ancestor or a person. So I guess the point that I want you to take away today is that there are different ways to construct knowledge and they're valid. So engaging with Indigenous crew on their knowledge is really important. But the other thing is just simply by putting yourself or looking at something and studying a natural phenomenon from another cultural perspective gives you a really good idea of the inherent biases you have while you're looking at it from yours. So when you go away, just try that that Māori conception of what is it and how does it relate to me first, and see how that might influence the way you think about something. Cool. Thank you. Sorry, mate.